Yeah, just stand socially distanced. 26 miles across the sea, Santa Catalina, the island of romance. Romance, romance, romance. I was 18 years old, just graduated from high school, and buddies and I are boarding this ferry from Southern California to Catalina Island, a 1 hour, 26-mile trip. And on Catalina Island are world-class restaurants and hotels, a famous casino, and miles of beaches and girls. I expected to see a lot of things on Catalina and a lot of expectations. The one thing I did not expect to see was Judy Whistler. I had a massive crush on Judy when I was 14, when we were 14. We lived down a long block, Angeles Vista Boulevard. I lived towards one end and she lived towards the other. And every chance I had, I took our dog for a walk so I could walk by her house. And often I found her outside palming a basketball, shooting some hoops, and talked to her. She was so cute. She was like 5'2", short hair, brunette. It was lovely. She was shy and didn't really look at me that often. She was demurred a bit. When she looked at me, though, it was quite lovely. She once invited me into her room to see something. Now, I'm 14 years old, and my idea of a crush had no fantasies involved. So going to her room, there was nothing that I imagined would happen. And it didn't. But 4 years later, after I had moved the following year, so I hadn't seen her in 3 years, this 14-year-old became an 18-year-old woman. Suddenly she had all the curves and she was just lovely. But don't get me wrong, because when I found her and I was excited and delighted to see her, it wasn't just that she was lovely, because I got a picture from a friend a few years ago that showed me at the same age. I sent this photo to our daughter saying, this is what I was like at 18. And she looked at me and said, And she showed it to a girlfriend of hers and said, who's he? He's hot. So I have this lovely woman by my side and hot Steve with her, and we're walking down the aisle, down the streets of Catalina Island, and she has gotten over her being so shy. She's looking me in the eye, and I admit to her, you know, I had a big crush on you. And she said, no kidding. And then she said, you do know that there was a good reason I was outside playing basketball as often as I was. I looked at her surprised. She said, I kept an eye out for you because I knew that when you walked by my house, 5 minutes later you're going to come back because you'd be at the end of the block walking your dog. So I came out to palm my basketball knowing you'd be there. You never figured that out. No, I didn't. Anyway, we had a really delightful conversation walking down the streets of Catalina Island, and we were kind of flirting with each other, and she said, you know, my family rented a cottage here. Come by this afternoon. So I said, yes, I will come by. I had all kinds of course, expectations. My fantasy world at 18 was alive and well. So later that afternoon, I showed up, and I had the other thing I didn't expect was running the gauntlet called Parents. And so her parents were in the sitting room, and I had to run the gauntlet of all kinds of questions before they let me really into the house. At this point, Judy said, you're the house kind of crowded. I got my siblings here and my parents are here. Let's go in my room so we can talk. Go into her room so we can talk. Okay, my fantasy world is alive and well. And I'm scanning the room, we're talking, we're sitting, we're having a really nice flirtatious conversation. And as I'm looking over the room, I scan the trash can. And in the trash can, I see something that's kind of odd. Something wrapped in tissue is that a blood stain and a string sticking out of it? It took me a moment to figure out what it was. And of course, Judy is following my look, and she figures out what I just saw. And she's upset. I imagine she's embarrassed. She summarily calls the conversation off and kicks me out of the house. It's like, oh no, all these fantasies, and it's just gone. I go back to my room and try to figure out what to do from here, and I said, okay, I'm going to deal with my grief by buying a pack of cigarettes and smoking to deal with my grief and sadness. That night I had a lifelong lesson. Smoking is disgusting. That was my first and last cigarette. I mean, really last cigarette. It's been a lot of years since I was 18. So I figure, well, today's fantasy is gone, both romantic and sexual. And I figured that was it. That was the end of my time that I would ever see Judy, because she was off to a college, one college, I was off to another. I had no way of finding her. And although I thought maybe I'll go back to her cottage and see if I can start this over, my ferry back to the mainland was the next morning. So I was done. And I figured that's the last time I was going to see Judy Whistler. I was wrong. 10 years passed, maybe 11. I was a senior programmer analyst for a company in Redondo Beach that built credit card software systems for retail department stores. And I was a head programmer on one from Toronto. And they were coming in for a site visit. And I thought, this is cool. So the CEO called a big meeting. And I was told by my manager that I almost wasn't invited because of the way I looked. I had hair out to here and a beard down to there, casual clothing, not at all the professional look that the CEO wanted. So they debated inviting me, but ultimately they had to. I was a senior programmer on the project. So the meeting went really well, and well, one of the reasons it went well is the senior engineer from the Toronto company, he had red hair out to here and a red beard down to here. His clothes was even more casual than mine. No big deal. And as I left the meeting, who was the executive secretary to the CEO? Yeah, I bet you know, Judy Whistler. Anyway, I looked at her and I realized, this is no longer the 18-year-old teenager I remember. She's a bit matronly a decade later. And I recognized her because of the nameplate. And we had a nice conversation. She looked at me and said, you know, I knew you were coming because of all the conversations about not inviting you. But frankly, I wouldn't have recognized you because there's so little of your face showing anyway. So I'm glad I knew you were coming. And that, frankly, was the last conversation and the last time I saw Judy. You know, I reflect back on all the fantasies we have about life, especially the teenage fantasies. Some of these fantasies just abruptly end. Some of them linger for a long time and then end. And some of our teenage fantasies, perhaps, they never end. And that none of those teenage fantasies that never end will ever be a topic of a story of mine. Thank you.